So this is lecture 3B, the other half of lecture 3, and I want to talk a little bit more about tissues. Um, we'll talk some about tissue cells again, but we will talk about more about tissues. And the reason for this lecture, while it may seem um, more difficult than you are used to, is that um, I want you to have an understanding of what the building blocks of our tissue, our bodies, our tissues, our organs are made from. And understanding these different tissue types, I think, is very helpful because not every cell is going to function the same way or even is supposed to have the same structure. There are four primary types, and so what we're going to do is specifically talk about these four types, and then we're going to go into some details that you're not going to be tested on, but I want you to be able to see this so that you have a full understanding of what's kind of happening on the cellular tissue level of your body. So there are four types. Know this: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue. So epithelial tissue, and you'll want to have an idea of where epithelial tissue is found, are body coverings, think skin, and body linings, think about the inside of your esophagus or the inside of your intestines, and also glandular tissue. Their functions are for protection, absorption, filtration, and secretion. So one of the hallmarks of epithelial tissues is that they cover and line your different body surfaces inside and out, and they often form sheets with one free surface. So think about your skin facing upward, free, the apical surface, and its other side that's anchored to what's called the basement membrane. They do not have blood. This is important. These are avascular. Your skin actually does not have blood. It's layers below your skin that actually bleed. And they regenerate easily if you actually have the nourishment available. So when you classify epithelia, you get different numbers of cells. Now, this is where I'm not going to get all particular on your test, but I do want to show you can have one layer or you can have multiple layers, which is stratified. So simple versus stratified. And the shape of cells can be squamous, flat like fish scales, cuboidal, obviously like a cube, or columnar like columns. Just to show you the difference between simple versus stratified, you can see different layers in the bottom one. Squamous, cuboidal, columnar. And here you can see some of the things that they do, like squamous cells, that one layer squamous at least, are diffusion and filtration, so that you can actually get certain things across these membranes and these layers of tissues, as opposed to other things that might be protected and kept out. If it's stratified, then it's a protection. Cuboidal, you have secretion, absorption. Think about your intestines, for example. Also with mucus, you might even think about your like the inside of your respiratory tract, up in your sinuses, down through the connection to your throat, down to your esophagus. If it's a single layer, we don't really have a lot of protection types of humans if it's a stratified set of layers. There are no simple transitional epithelial, in this case a single layer, but for stratified epithelial layers you do have some stretching in terms of protection, and so this is what happens with your urinary structures. This is what gives that ability for your bladder to stretch and contract. So I'm not going to go into details on the test of this, but I thought it would be interesting to kind of mention. So let's look at these in a little more detail, but not necessarily for greater depth of knowledge in terms of your test, just more greater depth of knowledge for your own sake. So you have the simple epithelia. So we're just basically adding examples. Simple epithelia are functions in absorption, secretion, filtration. They're very thin. They don't really protect you. If it's simple squamous epithelia, you're going to find these in places that are parts of your air sacs of your lungs, the formation of the walls of the capillaries, and you have different serous membranes that line and cover your organs in the ventral cavity, and you've talked about that in the lab as well. So just diffusion, filtration, secretion. Remember, diffusion is to allow some things across a membrane. Filtration is going to keep some things out from crossing a membrane, and secretion are going to be things like your glands and stuff that you're trying to get out of the body for waste or for things that we just want to communicate with or we need on the outside. So here's kind of what this looks like. You see these big air pockets with this simple layer around. Simple cuboidal. These are going to be found commonly in glands, the walls of your kidney tubules, even the surface of the ovaries. These can have cilia, which are these little hair-like protrusions that actually help to move things like mucus or even in parts of the reproductive cells to help things move around. That's not the same thing as on the sperm flagellum. That's a different thing. Okay, these are more like little hairs that cover the surface of the cell, not just a big single tail. Here we've got the simple columnar epithelia. You find these, they're the goblet cells that secrete mucus in places. They line the digestive tract from the stomach to the anus. So think about your intestines, for example. There are also mucous membranes that line these body cavities, and so they can excrete mucus along these linings. They can also have cilia to help propel mucus and things around as well. So you can see that here. And see, you can actually see that columnar pattern. So your long kind of cells. There is pseudostratified columnar epithelia, and these are cells that rest on the basement membrane. Remember, the basement is the side that actually connects to other tissues. You can have single layers, but these are some cells that are shorter, so it looks like they're stratified, but not really. You see these in the respiratory tract, either ciliated or not, and they're more for absorption in more functions for absorption or secretion. And you can see that here. You can actually see the cilia, those little hair-like protrusions along the surface of that cell. It's very interesting. Now, stratified epithelia consists of 2 or more cell layers, unlike what we were just talking about with simple. These are more for protection, and so we see kind of the most common is the stratified epithelium, and it's named for cells present at the free, which is the top surface that's not attached. Usually they're squamous, and they contain the ability to protect. They are a protective covering, especially when friction is possible. So think about your skin. You rub against things, you put clothes on your body. That friction could pull cells off, and it does, but it has the ability to reproduce those cells and to keep it from pulling off things that are too far below in the lower levels. Your mouth, of course, when you eat, you have friction. Your esophagus as you swallow. Okay, you can see those multiple layers all the way through here. Stratified cuboidal epithelium is 2 layers of cuboidal cells. They're also in protection. Stratified columnar epithelium are surface cells that are very columnar. We've seen what that shape looks like. And the cells underneath will vary in size. So the surface cells will have that columnar look, but others below may not. And then stratified columnar and cuboidal are kind of rare in humans, mostly in the ducts of large glands. Transitional epithelium, this is composed of modified stratified squamous epithelia, and these shape of cells depend on the amount of stretching, and so we've kind of mentioned that you really only see this in like the lining of your urinary system because they need to stretch to great amounts. We probably all understand what that means. So you can actually see this shape here, and then you get down to another connective tissue. So you have a basement membrane and you have that apical membrane. Glandular epithelia are associated, of course, with glands being able to secrete something. Most of these are going to be an aqueous or water-based solution that has proteins in it, and it's a very active process. You see this being used in the endocrine glands. These are ductless, so there's not like an actual specific spot that the secretion comes out of. It just diffuses across membranes into the blood. And you see this in the thyroid, adrenal glands, pituitary glands. And then there's exocrine. And exocrine glands are not like you see with endocrine where you have hormones, but exocrine is more about for digestion. And secretions will kind of empty, and they specifically happen through ducts. You see this not only with digestion, but a lot of times with digestion, associated with things with the liver and the pancreas and how they are connected with digestion, but also with oil glands and sweat glands as you specifically excrete those things outside the body. Oil, of course, is to help keep your skin pliable, protection. Sweat, of course, is to help you to evaporate and then cool off. See, evapotranspiration. Connective tissue. So our next tissue is connective tissue. It's found everywhere in the body, and it's does exactly what it says. It connects body parts. It's very abundant, widely distributed. Its purpose is to protect, support, and bind. Now in this case, you do get some blood supply in some cases that are, this is called vascularized. There are some that get poor blood supply or don't get blood supply, and that's avascular. So you kind of get a mix of that. And then there's also an associated extracellular matrix. It's a non-living material that's actually surrounding all the living cells, kind of as part of the binding ability. So there's two main elements to this extracellular matrix. There's what's called a ground substance, mostly made of water, but then there are adhesion proteins, which it sounds like, adhesive. It is to connect, to glue, to pull together, and also polysaccharide molecules. And these are big, long, large carbohydrate molecules that act like big long chains or ropes maybe. And then you've also got fibers. There's the form of collagen, white fibers, elastic, yellow fibers, and reticular fibers, which is technically a type of collagen. Now, some of the types of connective tissue that are most rigid, I would like you to know this. Types of connective tissue that are most rigid to softest or most fluid, you have bone, which is the most rigid, and then you have cartilage, dense connective tissue, loose connective tissue, and blood. Now, I'm going to go ahead and mention this just so I don't want to forget it later. But very interestingly, cartilage is actually the beginning stage for, or the step before, bone forms. So cartilage forms first, and then what will become bone starts out as cartilage and then ossifies. And ossifies is that idea of becoming bone, taking in calcium and becoming this hard material. This might make more sense to you if you think about it in terms of children. As we get bigger, your bones can't just be made, obviously, as single solid object. So there has to be something that's more pliable that can get bigger. And so as bones grow, as bones form originally, they form first as cartilage and then ossify into bone. And as bones get bigger, you actually have more cartilage produced that ossifies, and this pattern back and forth actually gives us larger bones. So just a side note, I think this is really interesting. So bone or osseous tissue, now I'm not going to ask you to go into great detail with this, just mostly know the most rigid to the softest, or in this case blood's basically liquid in terms of connective tissue. But bones are composed of something called osteocytes. I like looking at these cells. They're bone cells, and inside they have something called lacunae, these like cavities. And they have a hard matrix of calcium salts and a large number of collagen fibers. And their purpose is to protect and support the body. I think that one's pretty obvious. You can see these little lacunae, and there's even a central canal in the middle. They're very different, specialized kinds of cells, these osteocytes. Cartilage is less hard, more flexible than bone, and it's really only retained in a few places in the body. These are called chondrocytes, and you have hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage. Some examples of where cartilage is found would be your ears, your nose. There is, like in your sternum, you have some cartilage, some of which connects your ribs to your sternum and so on. Um, the hyaline cartilage is your most widespread type. Now, I'm not going to be asking you about these three types of cartilage. I just want you to know where some of these places that have cartilage are. Locations, so this kind of cartilage will be trachea, your attachments to your rib and your breastbone, the covers of the ends of your long bones, your entire fetal skeleton, as I was mentioning prior to birth, and then your growth plates in your long bones are hyaline cartilage. Here you can see where those are found and some of the cell types. Elastic cartilage is not going to be pictured, but basically it's very elastic and supports like the external ear. So that's pretty obvious, I think. Fibrocartilage is very highly compressible, and these are going to be your discs in between the vertebrae of your spinal column. Now you've also got dense connective tissue. These are going to be some of those fibers, like collagen fibers. Fibroblasts are the cells that make up these fibers. So these are going to be your tendons, ligaments, dermis. Okay, so these are not cartilage. These are dense connective tissue. Okay, now think about how connective tissue is all about connecting. I like to use the example of the dermis. You've got the epidermis, which is epithelial, no blood, and then when you get into the dermis you have some blood, and that dermis is helping to hold that epithelial cells on the outside of your skin to the underlying layers. So you're going to see connections at like those basement membranes to the dermis. Okay, here we go. Ligaments, tendons, you can see them on the cellular level, and you can see how they're very long and fibrous. Loose connective tissue, these are softer, you have more cells, you have fewer fibers than any other connective tissue except blood. So we have areolar, adipose, and reticular. Areolar connective tissues are most widely distributed. They're very soft, pliable, cobweb-like. They basically act like universal packing tissue and glue, holding things together. So it's a very loose network, and it can even, soak up excess fluid, which is not always a good thing. But you can see kind of what this crisscross set of connective tissue looks like. Okay. Adipose connective tissue, this is an areolar tissue where you have lots of fat cells, adipose cells, and its purpose is to insulate the body, protect organs, serves as a site of fuel storage. I do want to make a point that don't ever think that you should not have any fat. To have no fat would actually be really detrimental for you and your body, because you need the functions that fat comes with. The problem we have to think about is not to have too much fat. We don't want to over insulate, and we can actually pack our organs so much that they're not able to function. So we have to keep that in mind. We have this in subcutaneous levels, so kind of those lower levels right beneath the skin we have fat. It helps to protect our organs, such as our kidneys, and we've got little depots of fat, and as we all know, they go to specific places like the hips, the breasts, and the belly. Okay. Notice that there's a huge, big amount of fat inside those cells, and that's how cells can actually get bigger or smaller. So if you do exercise, these fat droplets that are on the inside can actually shrink, so you can make your cells shrink, but what you cannot do is make your fat cells disappear. The only way to do that would be liposuction. So if once you have new fat cells created, you don't get rid of them really, at least not to my knowledge. What you do when you lose weight is not about getting rid of fat cells, but getting rid of some of the fat. You burn the fat that's inside the cell and the cells shrink. But this also means the cells are still there, and then if you were to overeat start to gain weight, maybe become more lethargic, not exercise very much, what you end up doing is those cells are there, present, shrunk, and then once they have the ability to absorb and create the fat deposits for storage, they'll just inflate really quickly. And so it's one of the reasons why it's really easy to gain weight again. Reticular connective tissue is a very delicate network of interwoven fibers. And that's basically what reticular means, is very interconnected crossing fibers, very interwoven. And you're going to find these as part of the internal framework of organs. That's what we call a stroma, but it's the inside part. You'll find these with lymph nodes, the spleen, and bone marrow. Okay, here you go. You've got these interconnecting fibers working throughout with different cells around them. Blood is our last connective tissue and the softest, and actually not really even solid in any way. So blood cells are surrounded by kind of a fluid matrix known as blood plasma. There is a soluble set of fibers that are visible only when clotting, and it's basically a transport vehicle. That's what blood is for. It's a transport for the cardiovascular system, and that's the connective property, is it actually move things around the body. Nutrients, waste, and respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that's what blood does, which I think most of us are most familiar with. Okay, muscle tissue, our fourth type of tissue. Functions in contracting, for shortening, to produce movement. Okay, now notice it's talking about contracting. I will mention that the opposite of contract will be to relax a muscle. Okay, so you contract, relax, contract, relax. In fact, sometimes you contract and then you contract another muscle to help relax the first one. There are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, smooth. I would like you to know those three types of muscle tissue and where you might find them. Skeletal muscle is going to be packaged by connective tissue sheets into skeletal muscle. So obviously this is where you attach to the skeleton, you pull on bones or skin. This is something you have control over, this kind of movement, and so this produces gross body movements. Now gross, not disgusting, gross as in large or full body movements, and also facial expressions. So you'll see things like striations, multinucleate. There are actually more nuclei in some of these cells than than just one. It's kind of not normal in the way that we first talk about cells, but you can also sometimes get cells with more than one nucleus, and they're usually long and cylindrical, and you can see those kind of muscle fibers, as we sometimes call them. Cardiac muscle is involuntarily controlled. You don't do this. Your brain just kind of has it on autopilot. Although it is controlled. It's just not controlled by us in a way that we can actively change how our cardiac muscles work usually. It's found only in the heart, and its purpose is for the heart to pump blood through the blood vessels. There are some characteristic striations. You get one nucleus per cell here. They're short instead of long cells, and you sometimes get what's called intercalated discs, where cells come together and have these little junctions where the cells are actually connected and can communicate between each other. We see these here where those little kind of pink connection spots. But still, long, stringy kinds of tissues. Smooth or visceral muscle is also involuntary. These are found in the walls of our hollow organs, such as stomach, uterus, blood vessels. Peristalsis is a very typical activity, and if you imagine peristalsis like when you swallow, you can feel that food moving down. Now that's a controlled, well, actually it's not a controlled peristalsis. Once you start the process, you can't stop it. It's just going to go on its way to the stomach. But think about it like a toothpaste tube that you're going to take your hands and squeeze around one end and then just like pull that toothpaste tube through, and your hands are going to act like peristalsis, where you're pushing that toothpaste to one end, and that's what's happening with your food or your blood or in your stomach as you're passing food through to the small intestine. You don't get the visible striations. You do have one nucleus, and they're kind of spindle shaped. So there's definitely a little bit of a difference in the way they look under the microscope than the other muscle types. Then we get to the nervous tissue, and nervous tissue is connected to your nervous system. So the whole function is to receive and conduct electrical impulses to another parts of the body. They have irritability, they have conductivity, which means that there's a ability to recognize what's going on around them. Some stimulus will make them respond. These are composed of neurons and nerve support cells. You may hear of neuroglia. I'm not going to go into great detail with these, okay? Right now, just remember the basic idea that the nervous tissue is all about receiving and conducting impulses. And this is a type of communication through the body. We see this with the brain, with the spinal cord, and then with nerves that extend out from that. Okay, so we're going to kind of summarize some of these tissue types in the body. You can see the nervous tissue, the muscle tissue, the epithelial tissue, and the connective. And this is maybe a great little tool to help you study when you're going back and reviewing without having to go through everything first off. Go through this, look, see if you can remember where you're going to find your nervous tissue or your connective tissue. And then you may ask yourself, well, what's the hardest connective tissue? What's the softest connective tissue? Notice which tissues are not listed here that you should know about under connective. So you can use this as kind of a little self-testing method.